Long before the wheel, before the saddle, and before even the idea of domestic animals, humans stood at the edge of the open steppe and looked upon giants. Before them roamed the woolly mammoth, towering, tusked, and armored with muscle, fat, and a thick coat against the Ice Age cold. A single adult male could weigh over 6 tons. Its tusks alone stretched longer than a man's spear. To face such a creature with nothing but sharpened wood and stone might seem like madness. But to the prehistoric hunter it was necessity. And in necessity they found genius. They had no horses to chase, no metal to pierce thick hide, no fences to contain. Yet the mammoth was still a prize too great to ignore. One successful kill could feed a community for weeks, could provide bones for tools, hide for shelter, fat for fire, and tendons for thread. In the struggle of daily survival, it was the ultimate reward and the ultimate risk. The dilemma was clear. How do you bring down a beast that can crush you with a single misstep? The answer lay not in strength or speed, but in numbers, knowledge, and patience. Early humans were not born faster than their prey. They were not stronger, but they were clever, and above all else, they were persistent. Unlike the big cats or dire wolves that relied on ambush, humans used strategy. They became observers, tracking herds from a distance, learning their paths, their habits, and their weaknesses. Mammoths were social, intelligent animals. They followed seasonal migrations, returning to the same watering holes and mineral-rich soils year after year. They moved in herds, protecting their young and defending the old. But that very predictability became the human's first advantage. One of the oldest techniques involved timing the hunt to the changing seasons. In the spring, when thawing ice made the ground soft, or during winter migrations when herds had to cross frozen rivers, mammoths were more vulnerable to terrain. A slip, a stumble, a broken leg, nature itself became a silent ally. But terrain alone wasn't enough. To bring a mammoth down required a coordinated effort that few other predators on Earth could match. And this is where prehistoric humans excelled. Not in solo kills, but in group strategy. Dozens, sometimes even over 100, individuals participated in the hunt, each with a role. Some made noise, shouting and pounding the ground with sticks to scare or redirect the herd. Others acted as blockers, cutting off escape routes. The boldest, often the most skilled, were the ones who ran closest, flanking the mammoth with spears, torches, or thrown rocks. Without horses to pursue the mammoth across long distances, humans used something far more reliable: their own endurance. Unlike most animals, humans can run long distances without overheating. What they lacked in burst speed, they made up for in persistence. In some cases, they harassed the herd for hours, or even days, driving a selected animal away from the others, tiring it slowly until it could no longer fight. But even then, the job wasn't done. Getting close to a mammoth was a gamble. One wrong move, a poorly timed jab, a misjudged approach, and a hunter could be skewered or trampled. The tusks were weapons in their own right, sweeping through the air like scythes. The trunk could grab or shove. The feet, massive and fast, could break bone like sticks. So humans adapted. They created hunting zones. These weren't artificial fences, but cleverly selected natural traps. Narrow ravines, muddy riverbanks, sinkholes hidden beneath snow. These landscapes didn't need to restrain the mammoth completely. They only needed to slow it, to make it stumble long enough for the hunters to strike from safer angles. Archaeological digs across Eurasia have revealed these tactics in chilling detail. In some areas, ancient mammoth bones have been found stacked deliberately at the base of cliffs, mixed with human tools and fire remnants. These were not random accidents. They were orchestrated kills. Driven herds pushed toward a fall, one or two unlucky beasts plummeting while the rest fled. And it wasn't just adults who hunted. The whole community participated. Women and older children helped prepare spears, carry torches, and even create sound distractions. Elder hunters offered knowledge passed down from earlier hunts, where the herds migrated, which bulls were the most dangerous, how to read a mammoth's mood from the position of its ears and tail. Hunting mammoths wasn't just a task. It was a cultural event, one of the few moments in life where every member of the tribe was invested in the same goal. Songs may have been sung before the hunt. Dances or rituals performed for protection. Some groups likely offered the spirits a promise before the first spear was even thrown, that nothing would be wasted, that the creature's life would not be taken lightly. In these moments, the hunters weren't simply hungry bipeds chasing a meal. They were tacticians, coordinators, engineers. They read the land like a map and the mammoth like an opponent in a game of survival. And remarkably, more often than not, they won. To confront a mammoth was never a spontaneous act. It was not a chase, nor a lucky ambush. It was an operation. Long before the first spear was thrown, early humans prepared the land itself. They weren't just hunters, they were engineers of death. Mammoths were not just large, they were smart. They had excellent memory, social bonds, and a strong instinct to protect one another. Charging head-on into a mammoth herd was not an option. It would be suicide. So early humans learned to reshape their environment, turning nature into a trap. The first and most important step was selecting the kill site, a location where the mammoth's advantages, strength, size, momentum, could be blunted. Flat plains were avoided. In those open spaces, mammoths could charge or flee. But in narrow gorges, near swamps, beside cliffs, or at riverbanks, their movement could be restricted. Some of the most astonishing archaeological finds suggest that prehistoric people intentionally led mammoths toward ravines and sinkholes. In Central Europe, bone beds filled with mammoth remains have been uncovered in steep-walled depressions. These aren't natural graveyards, they're engineered death traps. Hunters likely used noise, fire, and human lines to spook the animals, then guide them toward a place where they had no exit. Once the mammoth entered the kill zone, it was already in trouble. In winter, frozen rivers became perfect ambush points. A mammoth crossing the brittle ice risked breaking through. Even if it didn't fall, its footing was unstable. Hunters on the edges could close in, attacking from multiple sides while the animal struggled to keep balance. In spring or fall, muddy riverbanks became natural snares. A mammoth could sink just enough to slow its retreat, turning it into a stationary target. In some regions, early humans may have even dug shallow pits. Though not deep enough to trap the entire animal, a single misplaced step could destabilize a mammoth's footing, leaving a leg caught or broken. This immobilization gave hunters the critical seconds they needed to close in and strike. But engineering a kill zone wasn't just about terrain, it was about movement. The goal was always the same: isolate one mammoth from the herd. Not the largest necessarily, but the one whose position, condition, or behavior made it vulnerable. Hunters observed carefully. A mammoth limping, a young male wandering at the herd's edge, an older bull showing signs of fatigue. These were the targets. Once chosen, the group worked together to divide the herd. Lines of humans, shouting, waving fire, banging stones, pushed forward, forming barriers of sound and fear. The herd would break formation, and the selected mammoth would be nudged, gently at first, then urgently toward the trap site. The process took time, sometimes days. Humans didn't need to strike immediately. They had patience. They wore the animal down. They exploited mammoth behavior, the tendency to defend calves, the loyalty to elders, the momentary chaos when the herd turned to flee. In that chaos, the chosen mammoth became isolated. And once it was alone, the trap could be sprung. Once the mammoth entered the designated kill zone, the full group mobilized. Hunters closed in from multiple angles. Some threw torches. Others shouted or howled, not just to distract the mammoth but to communicate with each other. Positioning was critical. A hunter couldn't just charge from the front. He had to watch for the tusks. The flank was safer, but only if the mammoth couldn't pivot. From the rear, there was risk of a sudden kick. Spears were thrown in volleys, first to test the skin, then to wound and exhaust. Arrows, if they existed in the region and period, would be aimed at the soft tissue around the eyes, mouth, or under the limbs. Some hunters carried clubs or axes, but only closed in after the animal had fallen. Even in a kill zone, a wounded mammoth could fight for hours. It could charge unexpectedly, smashing bodies and crushing bones. There were no guarantees. For every successful hunt, there were losses. Some traps failed. Some mammoths escaped. Some fights ended in blood and silence. But when the system worked, the payoff was enormous. At places like Dolny Vestinus and Pavlov in modern-day Czechia, archaeologists have found elaborate structures made almost entirely from mammoth bones. These aren't just proof of kills, they're proof of mastery. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of mammoths were processed at these sites over centuries. Hunters didn't just use the land to kill, they made those kill sites into seasonal hubs, returning year after year to repeat what worked. Over time, knowledge of these kill zones became communal. Passed from generation to generation, they were memorized like sacred maps. Old hunters trained the young not just in how to throw a spear, but where to stand when the mammoth panicked, how to read shifting winds before fire was lit, and how to use terrain like an invisible ally. In this way, kill zones weren't just places of death. They were places of learning and of reverence. Some groups left offerings at these sites, arrangements of bones, colored stones, and red ochre. Whether these were thanks, warnings, or prayers, no one can say. but they suggest that the act of killing a mammoth was never taken lightly. It was a feat, a story, a spiritual transaction between human and nature. And when the last echoes of trumpeting died out, and the final blow was struck, the people gathered. They sang. They feasted. They remembered. They had faced the impossible, and through skill, memory, and the shaping of the earth itself, they had prevailed. After luring a mammoth into a trap, or isolating one from the herd, prehistoric humans often resorted to a terrifying and effective maneuver: the spear circle. It was not elegant. It was not quick. But it was relentless. Picture it. A massive mammoth, 10 feet tall at the shoulder, its breath steaming in the cold air, muscles trembling from exhaustion, blood running from wounds on its flank. All around it, humans moved. Not frantically, but with deliberate pacing, encircling it like wolves, but smarter. Each carried a spear, a club, or a torch. Some had slings, others stones. The mammoth turned, eyes wide, trunk raised, sensing the walls of flesh tightening around it. There was no escape now. That was the point. This was the spear circle. A tactic not of brute strength, but of psychological pressure and precise timing. The strategy had one goal: contain the mammoth's energy until it could be safely brought down. These giants were not mindless brutes. They were intelligent, wary, and dangerous when cornered. A single charge could kill. A panicked bull could shatter the entire line if discipline faltered. But the spear circle relied on control, not chaos. Each participant in the circle had a role. The youngest or less experienced hunters remained at the edges, watching, learning, ready to fill gaps if someone fell. The core team, usually the most seasoned warriors, held the closest positions. They knew the signs of a mammoth ready to charge: the sudden stillness, the ear flaring, the rocking weight from foot to foot. They would spread wider in those moments, waiting for the storm to pass or the beast to commit. Attacks came in waves, not in a rush. Spears were thrown from a distance first, aimed at soft spots. Behind the front legs, under the belly, the joint of the knee. These weren't killing blows. They were intended to weaken, to bleed, to force the mammoth to pivot and expose new angles. When it turned toward one attacker, others closed in from behind, driving it forward, boxing it in. And all the while, noise filled the air. Shouting, whistling, chanting. Drums of rock against rock. It wasn't just to frighten the mammoth. It was to coordinate the humans, to signal shifts, flanking moves, or sudden charges. These primitive calls acted like commands in a battlefield, passed from one ring to another. If the mammoth attempted to escape, the circle shifted, like a tightening net. Some lines would pull back to widen the perimeter, others would close in behind. Movement was constant. Stopping meant dying. This technique was most successful with isolated bulls or older mammoths too large and slow to flee effectively. Young bulls, reckless and fast, were too dangerous to circle unless already wounded. Females with calves were avoided entirely unless the herd had already scattered, because a mother's rage was worse than any tusk. But the real genius of the spear circle lay in its ability to turn a mammoth's size against itself. These animals needed space to move, to turn, to run. By boxing them in, humans forced them into a state of constant defense, unable to commit to a charge without leaving their flank exposed. If the mammoth did attack, the group split strategically, no one standing directly in its path. As it passed, new hunters filled the gap, and spears followed the momentum. The mammoth bled a little more. The circle closed tighter. Sometimes the fight took hours, sometimes a whole day. The killing blow, when it came, wasn't always the most dramatic. It might be a perfectly timed spear to the heart when the mammoth stumbled, or a stone to the temple after exhaustion dropped it to its knees, or a final torch driven close enough to blind one eye and send the beast crashing into mud or rock. And when it was over, there was no cheer. The hunters approached carefully, always with caution. Even a dying mammoth could thrash violently in its final moments. Once it lay still, someone, often the hunt leader, stepped forward and touched it. Not to claim credit, but to acknowledge the risk taken and the sacrifice made. The spear circle wasn't just a tactic, it was a ritual, a test of patience, of courage, of unity. There was no room for ego. If one person broke the line, acted too early, or struck without command, the circle could collapse. In this way, the mammoth was more than a prey animal, it was a teacher. It demanded discipline, cooperation, and absolute trust in the tribe. In modern times, archaeologists have discovered mammoth kill sites in Siberia, Ukraine, and Central Europe where bones are arranged in semicircular patterns, surrounded by projectile points, charred earth, and flint flakes. These suggest that prehistoric humans weren't just killing giants randomly, they were setting the stage for the spear circle. In the absence of fences or pens, they became the fence. And the spear? That wasn't just a weapon. It was an extension of human will, aimed not at conquest but at survival. With no horses to chase down prey, with no iron to cut thick hides, early humans had to rely on a very different kind of power. The power of the group. When confronting a creature the size of a truck, armed with tusks like scythes and a skull thicker than stone, primitive humans couldn't afford to rely on brute force alone. What they lacked in raw power, they made up for in deception, misdirection, and ingenuity. Their tools were simple by modern standards. But in the hands of determined hunters, even the most basic item became a deadly advantage. Let's begin with the spear. By the Upper Paleolithic, the spear was no longer just a sharpened stick. It was a carefully constructed instrument of death. Hardened over flame, balanced for throwing, often tipped with flint, bone, or later antler, each was a work of utility. Some were short and used for stabbing at close range. Others, like the famed otlotl dart, could be thrown with enhanced speed and force thanks to a spear thrower, a curved device that acted like an arm extension, dramatically increasing range and power. One well-placed dart could puncture a mammoth's hide. But more importantly, it could deliver a wound that caused blood loss or infection, turning time itself into a weapon. Alongside spears, humans employed fire. Not to burn the mammoth, though flames could cause panic, but to control the flow of movement. By lighting small blazes behind the herd or along the flanks of a pathway, hunters could corral the animals toward ambush points. Fire created both a visual and a psychological barrier. To a mammoth, fire meant danger. Smoke meant disorientation. Light and noise together disrupted the herd's cohesion, separating the strong from the weak. Then came the tricks, the terrifying feints designed not to kill but to confuse. Hunters sometimes disguised themselves using cloaks of animal hide. Covered in fur, moving low and slow, they might approach a herd unnoticed, taking advantage of the mammoth's poor vision at close range. These tactics weren't foolproof. One wrong move and the disguise meant nothing. But when paired with terrain and wind direction, they allowed hunters to get dangerously close before striking. And there were decoys. In some communities, younger hunters were trained to run and shout on open ground, not as attackers but as bait. These individuals would draw the mammoth's attention, forcing it to commit to a direction, while the real hunters waited along the sides. It was terrifying work. Only the nimblest, the most trusted, were chosen for this role. A single stumble could mean death, but prehistoric humans weren't reckless. Their most powerful weapon wasn't even physical, it was memory. They learned from every hunt. Each failed ambush, each wounded comrade, became part of an oral archive of tactics. Older hunters passed down stories not just of where to aim a spear, but how to read mammoth behavior. How an older bull might bluff a charge before retreating. How a mother would cry out seconds before a herd stampede. How certain sounds, whistling, throat singing, stone clapping, could trigger different reactions. They learned to manipulate timing, too. One tactic, rarely discussed but critical, was the pause. In the chaos of a chase or a confrontation, the hunters would suddenly go still. No noise, no movement. To the mammoth, this was unexpected. Where once there was noise and pressure, now there was silence. The sudden absence of threat caused hesitation. And in that hesitation, the exact moment the mammoth stopped to reassess, came the second wave. Spears from the flank. Torches from behind. Pressure returned from all sides. It was a dance of stress and calm, fear and relief, used to control the flow of the hunt. In some places, rudimentary nets may have even been employed, not to trap a mammoth entirely, but to tangle its feet during a charge. Evidence for this is sparse, but strands of animal sinew found near kill sites suggest that large-scale weaving projects existed. Nets wouldn't stop a mammoth, but they could slow it down long enough for a spear to land. And still, even the best tools required courage. Close-range killing was the most dangerous task of all. When a mammoth was weakened but not yet dead, someone had to approach with a final thrust. That person had to dodge the tusks, avoid the trunk, watch the feet, and drive the point into the neck, chest, or spine, all while the animal screamed and thrashed in its final moments. This wasn't an act of aggression, it was a calculated risk. A duty. And those who succeeded were marked by both respect and scars. Archaeological evidence also hints at symbolic preparation. Before big hunts, some groups may have painted their bodies with charcoal or ochre, markings not just for intimidation but for ritual focus. Certain lines, circles, or animal prints could signify one's role. Flanker, distractor, killer, signaler. These markings reminded the tribe that everyone had a place in the dance. No one hunted alone. When the dust settled and the mammoth finally lay dead, the tools were gathered. Spears were inspected, broken shafts replaced, stone tips resharpened, firebrands extinguished. But before the butchering began, there was often a moment of silence or ceremony. For all their tricks and tools, prehistoric humans respected their quarry. They knew this. The beast had fallen not because of one man's strength, but because of many minds working together. It had been a contest of intelligence and nerve. The mammoth had tested every tool in their arsenal, and had nearly survived it all. Took everything they had, and that, more than the meat or the bones or the tusks, was the real reward. When the mammoth finally fell, its breath slowing, its body heaving one last time, there was no cheering, no wild celebration, just silence. The kind that settles over a place where something immense has ended. Because for prehistoric humans, killing a mammoth was not the climax. It was the beginning of a different kind of labor, and of reverence. The aftermath was as complex as the hunt itself. The first task was always safety. Even in death, a mammoth was dangerous. It could collapse onto a hunter during its final spasms, or roll downhill and crush someone under thousands of pounds of weight. Cautiously, the hunters approached, checking that the beast was truly still. Only then would the tribe move in. Not just the hunters, but the women, elders, and children. Everyone had a role now. The sheer volume of material from one mammoth was staggering. Its meat alone could feed a group of 30 to 50 people for weeks, possibly months if preserved properly. But mammoth flesh spoiled quickly in warm weather. Efficiency was everything. Knives of flint and obsidian were passed down the lines. Sinew cords were cut. Massive strips of hide were peeled back. Internal organs, still steaming in the cold air, were removed and set aside. The meat was divided methodically. Some cuts were eaten immediately, often roasted over nearby fires as the butchering continued. Fatty marrow from the bones was a prized energy source. The heart, liver, and tongue were delicacies, and possibly shared only among the hunters or elders. In some cultures, the first bite of liver was reserved for the one who delivered the killing blow, both as an honor and a spiritual connection to the animal. Preservation techniques came next. Strips of meat were hung over drying racks, smoked, or even buried in permafrost to keep for later use. Fat was rendered into grease, useful for waterproofing clothes, cooking, or even lighting primitive lamps. The hide, thick and tough, was soaked and scraped. Once softened, it could be used for tents, clothing, or coverings for winter dwellings. But the bones were the real treasure. Massive, dense, and durable mammoth bones became the foundation of early architecture in Ice Age Europe. At sites like Mazyrik in Ukraine, archaeologists have uncovered huts made entirely from mammoth ribs, femurs, and skulls. These were not temporary shelters, but long-term homes, built in areas where wood was scarce and snow was constant. Tusk ivory, too, was a highly valued resource. Soft enough to carve, strong enough to last, it was used for tools, jewelry, and intricate carvings. Some of the earliest known art, delicate animal figures and abstract forms, were etched into mammoth tusks. These weren't just decorations. They were expressions of thought, memory, maybe even grief. And in many groups, the mammoth's remains were more than practical. They were sacred. Some tribes marked the site of a successful kill with stones or totems. Others buried a portion of the animal, perhaps the skull or tusks, with ritual objects. There's even evidence suggesting that early humans returned to old kill sites years later, treating them as places of power. Places where something larger than life had fallen, and where the line between man and nature had momentarily blurred. Children were often brought to these sites, not to witness the kill but to see the bones, to learn, to be told the story. In this way, mammoths lived on not just in flesh, but in memory. There were also deeper, more spiritual beliefs at play. Some cave paintings depict mammoths with handprints above or around them, symbols of reverence, or perhaps apology. The mammoth, like the bear or the lion, was seen not just as an animal but as a being with presence, with spirit. To take its life meant entering into a kind of contract. You owed it something in return. That debt was repaid through respect, through the complete use of its body, through ceremonies, through the telling of its story. In times of hardship, mammoth kills were even more vital. During long winters or failed migrations, one mammoth could save a clan from starvation. That made the animal not just a target, but a provider, a reluctant ally, felled only when survival demanded it. And over the generations, as mammoth numbers dwindled, the significance of each kill deepened. It was no longer routine. It was rare, precious, sacred. The last great mammoths of the north, those that clung to cold island habitats long after they vanished from the mainland, may have been remembered not just as prey, but as legends. Eventually, they were gone, but the lessons they left behind endured. The way humans planned together, the way they read the land, the way they worked as one, regardless of age, gender, or strength. The mammoth hunt taught humans how to coordinate, how to pass down knowledge, how to face something impossibly large and still prevail. In that sense, the mammoth didn't just shape the Ice Age diet. It shaped Ice Age humanity. Even today, when people stare at the towering skeletons in museums or the cave art in Chauvet and Lascaux, they're not just looking at a long-dead animal. They're seeing a mirror, a reflection of early humans' boldness, their fear, their ingenuity. The mammoth wasn't just an obstacle, it was a milestone, and long after it vanished, its memory would continue to live, in bones, in stories, and in the very shape of human survival.